Pachinko, a game almost ubiquitous with the Japanese arcade culture, while at the same time a multi-billion-dollar industry juggernaut that has its hand into every prefecture of the Japanese Isles. But what is the appeal of this seemingly simple-minded game? Well, for the uninitiated, Pachinko is an arcade/gambling machine where people have to shoot these tiny metal balls into the right holes to get those same balls as payout. The game functions similarly to pinball machines, but the flippers are removed, and your primary action is to get these tiny balls into the right spot by adjusting the launch velocity of the initial shot. Aside from the satisfaction of precisely hitting the ball in the right hole and the ability to play more by receiving those same balls as payout, you can also sell those balls again for real money and/or prizes. However, back in the early 1900s, pachinko machines weren't known for this at all. They weren't even known as being pachinko. They were known as a children's toy Corinth game. No, not that one. Yes, that one. A simple wooden game station with nails, a launcher, some pockets, and it laid almost vertically on a table. This version was based on the game Bagatelle, which is basically if you put holes and poles in a billiards table and give that same table a bit of an incline. Though in comparison to the Bagatelle board, the Corinth game board was considerably smaller, mimicking these similar looking European coin-operated entertainment devices known as penny arcades. And since penny arcades also had their own version of bagatelles, some people even think that the modern pachinko machines were more based specifically on penny arcades than Corinth game. However, just like everything else in the world, these smaller Corinth game boards eventually grew in size as well and started being used in candy stores, markets, and by stall vendors in festivals. And it was during the 1920s where rewards were given for hitting the right holes in pachinko boards. Though since this was a children's game, it was mostly candy and toys. Corinth game also stopped being the name of this game and was soon referred to as Pachinko, basically meaning a small metallic strike sound. And they couldn't have thought of a better name for it, since one of the great joys of playing pachinko back in the day was the satisfying sound of a metallic ball hitting those same metallic nails. There were also machines during this time that where instead of balls they used the 1-cent coin, but was soon after banned because it showed the imperial seat on the coin, and many found it disrespectful to have this imagery of the imperial family used in this way in a game. Pachinko itself did rise in popularity between the 1920s and 1940s, turning it into a household name, becoming much more popular with adults. Basically it changed from a children's game to a more adult gambling game, where adults could win packs of cigarettes. Of course, Japan halted the pachinko industry during the Pacific War, calling it a useless industry, even dismantling already made pachinko machines along with household pots, pans and temple bells for scrap metal during the metal shortages Japan faced during the World War II. After the war, the ban of pachinko machines was lifted, but a new regulation made it so that only licensed businesses could own a pachinko machine, due to the Business Affecting Public Morals Regulations Act. During this new rise of pachinko, people began to modify older pachinko machines that survived the Pacific War. One person specifically, now heralded as the god of pachinko, invented a new standard of pachinko. This man was called Masamura Takeichi. Before Masamura, most pachinko machines had a grid of nails in their board with a lot of prize slots in them. Masamura devised a system that used less prize slots and rearranged the nails to create smaller pathways within the board. Since there were less nails now than before, the ball also behaved more erratically, somehow making it more popular, causing the very first boom in popularity for pachinko machines. And since Masamura didn't copyright his idea, anyone making pachinko machines could use his design, and they did. This new design is to this day known as the Masamura gauge. During this boom of pachinko, new innovations of the Masamura gauge also began to pop up. The most popular one was the Ranpatsu Shiki type machine. The Ranpatsu Shiki type machines were machines where you could fire shots more quickly in succession without having to reactivate the machine or reload every ball manually. Most of the time, the balls the machine barfed out were thrown into the loader that goes directly into the machine, so you can keep playing with your winnings. These machines allowed people to fire up to 160 balls per minute. This, on top with the Masamura gauge, caused pachinko to be at its most popular during the 1950s, where around 387,664 parlors were open in Japan alone. To give you a clear view of how insane that number is, that means that in all of habitable Japan, there are 3 parlors per square kilometer. However, this boom of parlors wasn't entirely because of the Japanese. During the 1950s, right after the war when Japan was giving back conquered territory, a good number of Koreans stayed in Japan, after either being abducted from their homeland or having to move due to job prospects. Koreans were the biggest non-Japanese ethnic group that lived in Japan. However, due to brewing conflict between North and South Korea, and since they weren't seen as real Koreans by the people actually living in the Korean peninsula, a large number of them decided that their best chances were still in Japan, since most of them have lived their entire lives in Japan. Sadly, these Koreans weren't treated well by the Japanese citizens, making it extremely difficult for Japan-based Koreans to find any work, meaning they kinda had to go into the dirty jobs Japanese people didn't want to do. Think of the service industry or, as you might have guessed, the pachinko industry. To this day, about 80% of pachinko parlors in Japan are Korean owned. It does feel very ironic though, since pachinko grew to be one of the biggest industries of Japan, boosting its economy immensely, when a lot of Japanese people didn't want to deal with the continued enforcements of stricter laws and regulations regarding pachinko parlors. Most Koreans, however, were happy to pick up those parlors that the Japanese left behind. One of these changes and regulations that threw the industry on its head was the ban of Ranpatsu Shiki machines. Since the Japanese government didn't like all their citizens just gambling day in day out, since this multi-shot machine was basically a money-burning machine by putting a direct line of winnings into the machine, enabling extreme gambling addiction in Japan. After these regulations, regular single-shot machines were still available for parlors. This setback didn't stop the parlors inventing new ways to hit that dopamine rush though. Tulips were invented and somehow the Dutch weren't involved. Before the invention of tulips, if a ball hit a hole within a pachinko machine, it just paid out a set amount of balls. But with these tulips, a mechanism was set in place where if you put a ball into those tulips, a mechanism opened these tulips up, and if you hit them again, a big payout would happen. Before most of these big changes, store clerks would manually fill these pachinko machines. That wasn't feasible anymore because of the large amount of pachinko machines installed. So they started implementing an automated system that refills these pachinko machines. Now, the reason why they needed that many balls and machines was because those pachinko balls were worth something. Kind of like poker chips. You could buy these balls for a set amount of money, but due to the Japanese strict gambling laws, you couldn't sell these balls back to the shop and actually make money. You could only win prizes like toys and cigarettes. So a group of pachinko parlors in Osaka banded together with a former police officer and invented a 3-store system. This system made it so that people could actually make money on the pachinko winnings, and it went a little something like this. You buy pachinko balls at a pachinko hall. You use those pachinko balls to win more balls. You go back to the pachinko hall and choose to win the special prize. These special prizes are worth set amounts of money. You can then leave the pachinko hall and go to the antique shop store right next to the parlor. This antique shop, by the way, is totally unrelated to the pachinko parlor next to it. They will buy the special prize for a set amount of money, and the antique shop will then sell the special prize back to the pachinko parlors. This way the parlor isn't participating in gambling and can safely run its business. If this whole system sounds familiar to you, you might have played some old Pokemon games where a similar system was put in place, where in one building you can gamble for tokens, and in the building next to it they were happy to buy those tokens off of you. In anticipation of the Olympic Games, a new type of pachinko machine was made called the Olympia. That had nothing to do with shooting balls and was just a slot machine where you can manually stop the turning of slots by hand. But they still call it a pachinko machine. Eventually these same type of machines also dug up in regular pachinko parlors and were named Pachi slot machines, and was yet another innovation within the pachinko industry to make more money off of you. But back to actual pachinko. Motorized launchers started to pop up alongside with more electronic components, due to the rise of smaller, smarter and better electronics available to the consumer market. It was during the 60s that a long-standing ban on Ranpatsu Shiki machines were lifted and made it available for people to yet again enjoy these fast type of pachinko machines, with the caveat that no more than 100 shots per minute can be made. However, even with these innovations, pachinko started hitting a decline around the 1970s. These caused pachinko parlors to double the price of pachinko balls from 2 yen to 4 yen. But to get more younger people involved with pachinko, Pachinko Day was established. They initially wanted it to be the 8th of August, making it Pachi Pachi Day, but due to the amount of festivals and other events taking place in August, they thought it was wiser to put this special day a bit later in the year. So from 1979 forward, every November 14th have been dubbed Pachinko Day. During the 80s, 4 different types of pachinko machines popped up, basically dictating the 4 categories pachinko machines would fall under during the late 20th century. The first one to pop up was Digi-Pachi, a popular machine that combined slot machines and pachinko in one machine, by activating a slot whenever a ball entered the right hole. These were named Type 1 machines. Secondly was the Hanamono machines, where 3 holes at the bottom were placed, named chuckers. Hitting these chuckers opens a wing on the top of the board. If you get your balls into the wings, it will enter a little tunnel-like game, and when it hits the V-zone, you win a jackpot. These are Type 2 machines. You also had Type 1 and 2 machines in one that combined the slot machine and the V-zone of both respective devices. Thirdly, we got the Kanri Mono machines that were quite similar to the Hanemono machines, where you need to hit a certain spot on the board to activate a winning state so you can actually win a jackpot. But doesn't seem to be limited to just the bottom 3 chuckers, but can also be the earlier mentioned tulip mechanisms. And last but not least, we got the Ipendan Yaku machines, which focus or rely solely on electric components in combination with the first 3 types. Like it can have slot machines, feathers, tulips, and are all powered by some sort of board computer. Card reader machines also started to pop up more and more, where you don't need to throw in cash or separately buy the balls. You can now just use the prepaid card to buy them all and play. During the 1990s and the early 2000s, a lot of regulations were being made to the ever-declining pachinko industry. And to not bore you with 10 minutes of legal documentation, I am focusing on the biggest one, in the 2004 rule revision that basically did away with the previous 4 machine classifications. And on top of that, they put a prohibition on a lot of the key features that became popular during the previous decade. Jackpot probabilities were also changed. But yeah, when you look at the documentation of the history of pachinko, from the 90s onward, pachinko has been constantly bombarded by regulations, law changes and campaigns. It is also no surprise that the amount of pachinko parlors has only been declining for the last 70 years. And yet, despite all that, despite the tighter regulations, despite the ever declining parlors, despite it never hitting any form of mainstream outside of Japan, it is still a billion-dollar industry. While the amount of parlors keeps declining gradually, the amount of earnings stay relatively the same, with its worst year being the 2020, during the height of COVID when no one was able to leave their house. And even then, during that time it still made $110 billion in that single year. In comparison, the entire video game industry in that same year when everyone was forced to stay at home made $155 billion. This is a worldwide industry during a time when people were forced to sit at home doing nothing but play video games, versus an industry that is mostly popular in one country during a year when leaving the house was frowned upon or even forbidden. Pachinko as a business is still so strong that after its decline, it can still put anime and manga franchises in the top 100 grossing franchises due to licensed machines. Fist of the North Star is the 19th highest grossing franchise of all time, with 99% of its income coming from pachinko sales, beating out popular franchises like Toy Story, James Bond, Space Invaders and Frozen. While with Konami, during the depths of their popularity when they cancelled Silent Hill and fired Hideo Kojima, was actually capable of making a profit again after switching from developing console games to mobile games and pachinko. Pachinko is nowhere near that and will probably be a financial powerhouse of Japan and the Japanese companies for a long time to go, even after 100 more regulations have hit it. I hope you learned something new today about pachinko, and if you did, shoot the pachinko ball at the subscribe button and find out more about the amazing Japanese culture. I'm Durcoin, and thank you for watching.